I hope you all are having a wonderful 4th of July weekend, getting to celebrate with your families. All right, so last week where we left off with our friend Joseph, he was not celebrating so much with his family. If you remember, his brothers threw him into a pit in the middle of the desert, and they were going to leave him to die, but then Judah, one of his brothers, came up with the idea instead to sell him as a slave to a group of passing Ishmaelites going through the desert. And we talked about how Joseph was a type of Jesus. So he pointed forward to Jesus and resembled Jesus in some way. And the way Joseph did, was he was betrayed by one who should have been closest to him, his brother Judah, just like Jesus was betrayed by his disciple Judas. And they were both sold into the hands of enemies for just a few pieces of silver, really. But both with Joseph and with Jesus, they were abandoned by people, but they were not abandoned by God. God still was looking out for Joseph and had a plan for him. And we saw God's graciousness in the beginning of chapter 39 last week, verses 1 through 6. We saw a couple ways that God was clearly with him. First of all, where Joseph ended up, he ended up in Egypt. And with who, he ended up with Potiphar, who is someone pretty high up in the Egyptian court. And then he was also blessed with how Potiphar saw Joseph. He obtained grace in Potiphar's eyes. So Potiphar really liked him, and he was also blessed with what was put in his hands. He was given power over a lot of Potiphar's belongings and respect. So we see even when people try to grab things out of Joseph's hands, God puts things back in there for his good purposes. So far we've seen a lot of things that have happened to Joseph, but we haven't exactly seen much of what Joseph has done, much of his character. So this week we're going to see a lot more of his character and going to see another way or two how he is a type of Jesus. So if you guys want to turn to Genesis chapter 39 and read verses 7 through 19. All right, so what are some things that stood out to you about Joseph? Okay, so we see he had integrity. He was concerned about doing what was right in God's eyes and also in his master Potiphar's eyes. And he didn't just have integrity, but he had persistent integrity. The story tells us day after day, even though Potiphar's wife was trying to tempt him and pull him into something bad, he turned and resisted temptation. So he was persistent in being faithful to God and his master. We also see that he acted wisely. So when Potiphar's wife grabs him by the cloak and tries to force him, he turns around and runs away from her, which is exactly what the Bible tells us we're supposed to do with temptation. We're supposed to flee from it. But we also see, unfortunately, even though Joseph acted righteously and faithfully, the wicked again get the best of him, and he ends up getting thrown into another pit, this time prison, even though he did nothing wrong. But we'll see, once again, even though he's abandoned by people, he is not abandoned by God. So we can go ahead and read the next passage and see how God is still at work in his life in this new pit. So you can go ahead and read Genesis chapter 40, verses 5 through 19. Okay, so if you remember, one of the reasons that Joseph's brothers hated him was because of the dream he had and the way that that was interpreted. But here we see Joseph's ability to interpret dreams really comes back and helps him. Now, did you notice any ways that Joseph had changed? Maybe take a second and look back at the passage, see if there's anything different about him. Okay, so last time when he was talking to his brothers, he didn't seem too concerned about what they thought, how they felt. But this time he has keen sight, and he sees that the baker and the butler are not happy. And so we see he has attention to others. And we also see that he is very humble. He's not so excited to assert that he's going to be ruler, but he goes ahead and shows faith in God and says that it's through him that he can interpret these dreams. So he doesn't try and take the glory for himself. And we also see that his interpretation is right. He's correct. So this is another way that Joseph is a type of Jesus. He has a special type of vision, a special way of seeing that allows him to see these crazy dreams and look past their usual meaning to their deeper heavenly meaning. So he has a sort of heavenly vision that is able to prophesy about what is true. And he uses this vision not to build up himself, but to help others and to tell them the truth. Now, we saw him already interpret 2 dreams. There's one more person that has to have his dream interpreted. So why don't you all go ahead and turn to the next chapter and read Genesis 41 verses 1 through 8 to see who this final person is. Okay, so we see the final person is going to be Pharaoh himself. Now, while again, poor Joseph was forgotten by the butler, and the butler didn't tell Pharaoh right away about Joseph's special abilities, 2 years later, God still remembers Joseph and will use him at this time to help not only Pharaoh and not only himself, but all of Egypt. So after Pharaoh has this crazy dream, Butler finally remembers Joseph and tells Pharaoh about his special ability. And Pharaoh brings him up out of prison, and Joseph is able to interpret this dream about these 7 cows. And he, with his heavenly vision again, is able to say that these dreams both mean the same thing, and they're both pointing to 7 years of plenty that Egypt is going to have, where their crops will be abundant and they'll have lots of food and riches. But then after that, there will be 7 more years of famine, where they will not have good crops, and they will hardly have enough to survive on. So Joseph tells them that this is a warning they need to store up during the 7 years of plenty so that Egypt can survive during the 7 years of famine. Now, let's see how Pharaoh responds to Joseph's interpretation of the dream. And you can read the final passage for today, Genesis chapter 41, verses 37 through 43. Okay, so things have taken a dramatic turn for the better for Joseph. Pharaoh is thrilled, and he decides to set Joseph as a ruler over all Egypt in order to wisely save up. And we see that this isn't just about him recognizing Joseph as someone special, but he says that God has shown you all these things. So God is receiving the glory. Now, if we were to look at a graph of Joseph's life, we see that he's had a lot of downs and ups. Started with his family, then he ended up getting thrown into a pit in the desert, left for dead. Then things rose a little bit when he became a slave, because at least his life was prolonged. And then he ended up in Potiphar's court, where he obtained a little bit of favor. Next, he was thrown back into the prison through more wicked plots. Then he raised a little bit because he obtained favor and was head of the prison. And then he goes up way, way beyond where he ever was with his family and becomes second in command over all Egypt, one of the most powerful countries in the world at this time. So, as you can see, God had not forgotten Joseph at any point or any time. And if you think back to Jacob's life, his father, there were a lot of times when he probably wondered, what is going on in my life? It doesn't seem like anything's going right. But God had a plan. And we, as people in the family of faith, must have far-sighted vision to see beyond what the world sees and to envision the bigness and hugeness of God's plan. But the only way we can do that is through the help of God's Spirit, which helps lift our eyes and helps us to see beyond earthly things. So, the little ditty that I have for this week is, God's Spirit is the Spirit that lifts our eyes. He is eager to surprise with the greatness of his plans and the deliverance of his hands. So, once again, God has turned these bad things into something good. Not only to bless Jacob, not only to bless Joseph, but to bless all of Egypt. So, next week we will get to see a little bit more of Joseph's brothers and to see if there's any change in that relationship as they left it. All right, so thank you guys for paying attention again. And again, I hope you all have a wonderful weekend. All right, bye-bye.